Peace be upon you, and welcome to Way Stations. My name is Rehan Khan. In this podcast, we are going to cover discussions about topics which encompass art and culture and education and history and religion. And we hope that Way Stations becomes essential listening for those looking to recapture what it means to be human in the modern age. In each episode, my co-host, Dr. Walead Mosaad, and I will explore the ideas and the themes that are shaping human thought and practice. And Way Stations is really about celebrating the pursuit of living life as a journey, treading softly upon the earth and offering other wayfarers, that is, you who are listening, a place of respite from the rigors of the road. Now, as this is the first episode, let me take a moment to introduce my co-host, Dr. Walead, after which he'll do the same for me. So, Dr. Walead is an internationally recognized scholar in Islamic studies and human development. His academic and traditional training has accorded him the opportunity to work with communities as a teacher and as a project driver. He's completed degrees from Rutgers University and Fath Islamic Seminary in Damascus. He received his PhD from the University of Exeter in Arabic and Islamic Studies, and was also classically trained at the Al-Azhar University. He's currently the chair and scholar in residence of the Sabeel community. He's traveled extensively throughout the Muslim world, as well as Europe and the Far East, delivering lectures on various topics, including spirituality, ethics, and intercultural peace building. So welcome, Dr. Walead.
Thank you, Rehan. It's a pleasure and an honor to launch this endeavor with you here in our inaugural session. And I look forward to our discussions, and hopefully our audience also will find a lot of benefit in that. Rehan I've known for several years now, and he's a good friend in addition to being my tennis partner. He is an observer of history and technoscience, and has always been intrigued by how ideas and inventions move from one civilization to the next, and how they change as they shift across different cultures. And thus, he's also a published author. He's published several works, amongst them Tomb of Empires, and also a Carnegie-nominated trilogy around the Ottoman Empire and Tudor England. And he also just launched the upcoming fantasy sci-fi series Tales of Khayal, set on the Earth-like planet of Iklil. These novels also ask readers to consider the role of virtue within the human story. Outside of his novels, which I'm sure keeps him very busy, Rehan is also a visiting professor at an international business school, where he teaches postgraduate courses in moral leadership, personal influence, and AI in the future of work. He's also the author of a business book called Distracting Ourselves to Death, which analyzes why we are so distracted and what we can do about it, which actually sounds very relevant to some of the discussion that we hope to have in this session.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Walead, for the very kind introduction as well. And as our listeners are sort of tuning into our voices to this first episode on Way Stations, as a reminder, we're really here to really kind of explore what does it mean to be human in this kind of modern age. And the first topic that we've chosen to look at is the loss of sacred knowledge. Now, even within that title, what do we mean by loss? What do we mean by sacred? What do we mean by knowledge? And people from perhaps different parts of the world, different cultures, different belief systems will interpret that in a multitude of ways. But really, I guess that, the first question to ask to you, Dr. Walead, and obviously, we're going to ask each other a bunch of questions, and it'll be quite conversational, but I guess to really open it up, in terms of as a discussion, what do we mean by the loss of sacred knowledge in terms of how do you see that? And, in what kind of examples come to mind for you?
Well, it's very interesting. And you mentioned the terms that we're using here, which I think we ought not take for granted that we're all on the same page in terms of what they mean. So I want to just maybe to address the idea of knowledge, and is there a kind of a knowledge that has a sanctity to it or sacred versus other types of knowledge? And obviously, myself, and you were people of faith, and we endeavor to be practicing Muslims. So we're always going to, I think, couch everything that we see in terms of that prism. But I think people can appreciate that there's a difference between collecting facts and information and the idea of knowledge. And from my perspective, knowledge is not just gathering information, and whether it's in a file on your phone, on your laptop, or even books on your shelf, but it's actually, what do you carry with you? And as you mentioned earlier in the introduction, when you walk through life, what part of that influences the person that you are, in terms of how you interact with others, in terms of your goals and your objectives in life, in terms of what you think about what happens after life, right? So these are all things certainly that knowledge would have to address. And um, I think the sanctity of it, or the sacredness of knowledge, comes from the perspective that it's something above and beyond the human capacity to produce on their own, let's say. And even non-religious people have remarked, looking at the cosmos and looking at things of life and saying, there's something sublime about it. There's something like, what, this is not a person's doing. There's more to this than that. So I think, as just kind of a basic understanding of it, it's the ability to recognize that, let's say, otherworldliness, or something just beyond human observed or human produced knowledge, that there's something sublime about the universe, something sublime about the human condition. And if we recognize that sublimity, then that means perhaps I walk through life, as you mentioned earlier, softly and gently, and treat it with kindness and respect and compassion and so forth. So, that's kind of in a general terms. And obviously, if we're Muslim, and we have the Quran, and we have the Sunnah, and we have, that is how we see things. But I think even for people who may not necessarily follow that, but they would believe or subscribe to the idea that, no, there is something about this life that's just more than the sum of its parts, so to speak. And that brings right into the idea of loss. And I think maybe if I had to define what does that loss look like, I would say that people who buy into the idea that it's merely the sum of its parts, what you see is what you get. And then this place just becomes sort of, a mass of individuals, each seeking to take their piece of the pie, rather than looking at life as one big collective that we all share in, and not just us, as in the people that are living right now, but even future generations, and even the past generations. So that we're all kind of in this together, and we're all trying to figure it out together, and we're all walking through it together. And then that means we have a responsibility, both to people who came before us and people who will come after us. So, is there a loss of that idea? I think, if you had to be objective, and unfortunately, I would say yes, to a great degree, that many human beings today don't really subscribe to that. And I think in the past, when people had more of a faith-based or religious-based, or even maybe they weren't so particularly religious in terms of their practice, but I think in terms of worldview, several hundred years ago, and maybe not even several hundred years ago, several decades ago, that people were more in tune to that idea than let's say they are today.
So on that point there, you mentioned about the loss of maybe a wider collective view in terms of communities. So if we as a community are losing that sense of what's important, how is that going to affect, people where they are in terms of the communities? Because that connection is disappearing. So how does that play out? What do we see happening then?
Well, I think it's to be blunt, it's too obvious to see the effect, and not to give the plot away and let people know how old we actually are, but I think we lived through we lived through previous times, and not that long ago, when people were, their time was not dominated by devices, and now we have AI, and kind of this what I like to call a mediated, orchestrated existence, right? Which it doesn't necessarily reflect, what's actually out there in the natural world, and rather we're getting our information or our knowledge or how we see things via entities that are mediating that for us, and it's not a direct observation, let's say. And I think as a result, we feel more disconnected than ever from individuals to the next. And, the cliche uh, vision of people living in the same household, not sharing meals together. You have the children upstairs in their bedrooms, everybody's on their own device, and the parents are doing the same thing down in the living room. At least several decades ago, people were watching the same TV program together, right? Like in the 80s and the 70s and even the 90s, one TV set, everybody's in front of it. And at least there was something collective about that. But nowadays, we don't really have that either. Everybody's very much individualized, and the thing that is mediating what they see is the algorithm, which probably is a podcast for another day that I'm sure you can say loads about. But I think that's the effects are obvious, and I'd be interested to see your perspective on that too.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think, can I just ask you one more thing here? Because one thing I guess we're seeing then is as people's lives or people's life becomes mediated through something, it seems to me that there's a loss of connection with the divine or the connection with where it's coming from. And in many ways, this reminds me of the story of what happens in Makkah, really, with the introduction of idols, because the Abrahamic faith was introduced, and there was the worship of the one God, and it was a direct connection to that one God. And as the idols came, the Meccans at the time, they didn't stop believing in God,
Mm-hmm.
but the relationship with God was almost like mediated through something. So their worship was mediated, and I
Mm-hmm.
don't know if that's stretching the analogy too far, but it seems to me that our experiences are being mediated through something rather than actually having a real experience. I don't know, maybe I'm stretching the analogy too far, but I feel like there's something there.
No, I think that's a very astute and interesting observation. And I think there's always a temptation to say, oh, look how things have changed now and how things have degraded. And if we could only return to the past. And I don't think we're here to say that. I think you made a very good observation that these things tend to be cyclical more than linear. And what I mean by that is if there was kind of a third party mediated existence for people living in Mecca during the time of the Prophet Muhammad SAW, and then he was sent by Allah to address that situation, then I think certainly this has repeated itself throughout history. And you, of course, as an observer and a keen observer of history, I think you're aware of that. And so, that kind of, I want to give people hope also. I don't want to say that this will always be like this and it'll never change. And no, actually, it will change. And the idea is that people who have the ability to change things, and even via small, sustained collective efforts, things can turn around. And at the very least, you can do so in your household and the people around you, and so forth. And I think it's always trying to lift that veil. The parable of the veil is often used in Muslim discourse, especially with spirituality. And I think we have a lot of veils today, right, that we have to kind of make our way through, whether they're our own doing or kind of others doing. But once those veils are lifted, at least we wade our way through them, then we can have, and I think we have the potential to have the same potent, impactful experience of life with all that entails, including the spiritual aspects, as anyone had centuries ago or 1,000 years ago. I don't think that's not impossible. And in fact, I believe we will eventually, and people will be able to find that once again.
Yeah. And can I just ask one more thing, which is about I feel like maybe you could bring out a bit more, which is around when we say loss of knowledge, what type of knowledge are we talking about? Are we talking about like, knowledge that comes from the prophets, or what type of knowledge are we talking about that loss of?
Well, I think, there are different routes to knowledge, obviously, right? I mean, there's experiential knowledge, things that you observe, if you want to work on a cure to cancer, there's a particular route to try to figure that part out, and there's different ways to go about doing that. And I think that what we're talking about, what I'm at least trying to address, as I mentioned earlier, is this knowledge that is based upon, let's say, for lack of a better word, inherited wisdom. And that inherited wisdom can be prophetic knowledge. It can be things based upon prophetic knowledge. It could be, knowledge of even the ancients, like the ancient Greeks and so forth. That people of letters and of deep study and contemplation arrived at, certain understandings and certain answers and so forth. And I think all of that is quite beneficial. But I think there is a marginalization of that and kind of not an appreciation for that sort of thing, because we live in an age now where it's always very quick paced and fast, and we want to get to the latest and greatest. And part of that is predicated on the idea that as we continue forward in our time journey, society, that is civilization, then we're always going to have better answers than our predecessors. And I don't think that's necessarily true. And I think that's part of what's holding us back. So I think the first step is to acknowledge and understand that those that came before us, especially when they were closer to the prophetic periods, had a lot more to say and a lot more that we can benefit from. And we ought not just dismiss it out of hand because it doesn't work for today, or it's antiquated, or how are we going to implement it. And that's why the role of people who are constantly kind of within that intellectual scholarly community have to be there, because they have to continually contextualize and sift through all of this. In Islamic culture, we call inherited wisdom in books it's called the turath, and that literally means inherited. Means the inherited thing, the inherited wisdom. And I have to admit, not all of it is going to be particularly useful for us today, but much of it will be, or much of it is. But it does take people who are familiar enough with it, and within that community, let's say, of learners and scholarship, who can make their way through that. And now, with loss of institutional knowledge and institutional power that existed, previously, we have fewer and fewer people who can actually make their way through that. And I think that's one of the big challenges we're facing also.
Yeah, good.
So, but I've talked it from kind of maybe a religious perspective. I'd be interested to hear if you think this kind of extends to other things that we see in terms of practices in life and how that's been affected.
Yeah, I guess the thing that strikes me where there's been a loss of sacred knowledge is in the area of art.
Mm-hmm.
And, the great Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy, he wrote a book called What is Art in, I think it's about 1897 or something. And he argues at his time in 1897 that art has become the pursuit of satisfying people's ego. So he's writing in 1897, right? So he's now saying artists are pursuing their ego. They're too full of themselves. And he's really saying that, we should ask ourselves this question: what is the purpose of art? And then he goes on to explain, and he says, look, art is about establishing beauty. But then he says we need to define what is beauty. And then he says, well, beauty is anything that will point us in the direction of God.
Interesting.
Right? So he's defining the purpose of art as creating beauty. And then he's saying beauty is anything that will point you or remind you about God. Okay. Very interesting. Very interesting. And I think for many of us who come from a faith tradition, our role as artists, we have to remind ourselves, we have to really question ourselves that, what is that pursuit that I'm pursuing through my art? What does that sacred knowledge look like? Because I think, as human beings, we all have a need to really organize ourselves, our feelings, our general sense of the world, these emotions that we have, whether it's joy or pleasure or pain or fear, whatever it is, we have this need to really organize this into a story that we tell about ourselves and about where we're going. And when that story is hopeful, when we feel like we're heading towards a horizon where maybe there's a moment of transcendence where
Mm,
you know, transcend from this world to another world. That's actually a really hopeful story to hold on to, right? Because if you're explaining your everything that happens to you in life through the prism of that story arc, I think it's a hopeful story. Whereas if you think that, well, this world is it and that's it, you know, that's pretty depressing, because if you don't achieve what you are looking to achieve in this world, you're going to turn inward. You're going to look at yourself and you're going to say, why am I like this? And why am I like that? How have I
mm,
changed this? How have I changed that? And you start tinkering with yourself rather than, yeah, and you lose sight of that. So I think what art is often about, and what, you know, storytelling is often done, it's looked at this question about, you know, addressing how to live with hope, right?
mm,
And
mhm,
and great novels and great stories have always done that. How can we live with that sense of hope, really? Because, as I say, the opposite of hope is, its antonym, if you like, is misery. It's despair. It's despondency. And so, you know, art is almost like gives you that propulsion to get away from that. And I've, you know, heard you speak many times about the fact that the senses, the human senses of seeing, of hearing, and so on, these are like the pathway to your spiritual heart. And so, you know, God is telling us to protect these pathways. So
mm.
what kind of art are we consuming, right? How sacred is that art? And so, as a writer, and for other people who are artists, who are poets and sculptors and so on, we have to really ask ourselves that question: what's the purpose of
Right.
my art? Because in that, it can be very sacred, or it can be very egotistical. And so, if you look at the
Mm,
history of art in the Muslim world, whether it was the design of mosques or great buildings, often you would go into them and you would be marveled at, mashallah, oh, wow, this, it would remind you of God, because the orientation of the artist and the architect and the designer was to do that. And I think that if we live in the world today where, when we're consuming art in its multifarious forms, and it's not reminding us about God, then I
mm.
would say that's a loss of sacred knowledge. Does that kind of make
Yeah,
sense?
that
Yeah.
that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I was just when you were talking, I was just thinking about I was recently in Istanbul, Turkey. It's a place I go back to probably yearly. I think as being I guess a fan of the Ottoman culture as I am, and you walk into one of those old Ottoman mosques and you just get this sense of awe and of humility, and you get the sense this is bigger than about a person, right? And then about a celebration of a particular person. The famous Ottoman architect Sinan Basha, and he designed many of those beautiful mosques, but you get a sense that he never made it about himself, right? It was about something celebrating much higher than himself, and you know that loss there. I think if we get down to it, it's not so much in as much a loss of know-how or methodology, but it's a loss of those particular types of people that the world used to produce, I think. And if we're being fair, I don't think it was just merely in the Muslim world. I mean, even in Europe, walk into the Hagia Sophia or the Hagia Sophia, which is right across from the Blue Mosque or Sultan Ahmed Mosque, and you're also filled with that sense of awe. And I think the Ottomans recognized that also. They didn't level the building; they kept it, right, and later repurposed as a mosque and then a museum, then back to a mosque. But they recognized that, and even they co-opted some of the things that were there, and they built, smaller mosques very similar to the Hagia Sophia in the early period, also on the even on the Asian side, on the Üsküdar side, and because they appreciated what they saw even in the Byzantine architecture. So, because they too saw it as a celebration of God, even though we may differ with Christians on how we actually see that God, but nonetheless, I think the telos is very similar. So, are we, does the society that we live in, the communities that we try to nurture, they produce people who are thinking along those lines and thinking about contributing to, whether to art, whether to culture, whether to the human enterprise in general. on those lines, or is it something that's very become very egotistical, maybe perhaps narcissistic, and with the proliferation of social media, everyone just wants to be famous for the sake of being famous. People used to be famous for actually doing something, and they weren't seeking fame per se, but
Mm.
their contribution was recognized, and now we have kind of a lopsided inverse,
Mm.
and the people who actually are contributing something, no one is really recognizing, and it's just kind of the lowest common denominator. Things that appeal more to the ego, right, and the lower self, and this kind of dichotomy of like a higher self and a lower self, I think is very valid and very important for why we've gone this way collectively. That is, obviously there are pockets here and there, and there are individuals here and there, and that's where the hope lies. But I think in terms of a greater trend in society, I think it's gone the egotistical way, unfortunately.
So can I just maybe just pull that out a little bit more in terms
Mhm.
of a theme, which is we've been speaking a little bit about so far loss of sacred knowledge, and hopefully for the listeners, we've provided some examples of what that could mean from different fields. But I guess the question before we look at what can we do about it, I think one of the other questions to maybe explore would be, how did this kind of end up, and how do we end up in this situation, and was it something to do with religion receding from the mind of the populace? Was it something to do with ideas from certain philosophical traditions influencing popular culture? I mean, how do you see that? What were the things that kind of drew a wedge between modern people and the sacred?
Well, that's a conundrum, right? I mean, I think, like we pointed out earlier, even in the Meccan period, there was kind of, and according to most Muslim authorities, there were no prophets between Jesus and Muhammad, alayhim salam. So that's 600 years where you had probably religion receding and these other things taking place, and idolatry was introduced into Arabian Peninsula to the degree that even it was claimed to be the religion of Ibrahim, of Abraham, alayhi salam, and even that sort of misaligning of what actually was his religion, yani, and but obviously six centuries is quite a long time for that sort of thing to happen. But then you saw a resurgence with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But I think we get the feeling that this particular ebb in the kind of tide of humanity feels a little bit more, I don't want to say permanent, but a kind of a little bit more severe and than before. And I mean, if we look to the scriptural literature and legacy, there is this idea of fasad al-zaman, and things will deteriorate, and they will more rapidly deteriorate as we get closer to the last days. And many people have claimed that we're on the precipice of that, or whatever that means, whether it's a century from now or several centuries. But I don't think it's actually that helpful to dwell on that too much, because that's not really, even when a man and asked the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when is the hour? He said, "What have you prepared for it?" So he redirected his question to not when is that. Don't worry about when it's going to be, but what are you doing right now? So I think that's a question for us. What are we doing right now? And perhaps looking at how and why this happened. But if we were to do that, then we'd have to say then something that our predecessors did, even though they produced these beautiful things, something went wrong along the way also. And to be honest, I'm not sure I'm quite prepared to do that. I think that it's a testament to the nature of this life, right? It's imperfect and it's temporary. And no matter how great something is, it's always going to be temporary. No matter how in bloom the spring may be, and all of the flowers and the roses and things like that, you always know that it's temporary. You always know it's going to go away. So even civilizations are the same. They come into full bloom, and then there's going to be an ebb, and then there's going to be deterioration. And I think that's just to remind us that don't look for perfection in this life. Don't look for completion, and your focus should be on the next life. And as Muslims or as people of faith, I think that's the message we take from this. And then we think about, okay, what is it that we're doing right now? Not to bring back past glories. That's not what I think we should be doing. But what are we doing right now to improve our present, and also a better future for our children, our grandchildren, and those that come after? Yani.
Yeah, and I guess there's something that really comes to my mind here. Last year, I remember I was in Canada for a family wedding, and I had the opportunity to also visit a Native American reservation, and just watching the way they performed the sacred dance, it reminded me of many things from our tradition. I must be honest, really, and
Mhm.
many good things. I felt a real connection when I was there. And if you look at the history of how the European powers went into the Americas, when they arrived, originally they would say to the Native Americans, we want to take this land from you. And the Native Americans would say, well, it doesn't actually belong to us. We're just the
Mhm.
stewards. We're the Khalifa. We're just looking after it. We can't give it to you because it didn't belong to us in the first place. Whereas that model didn't fit the European mindset of private property, which is like, it's my property. I'm going to put my fences down and I'm going to own that. And I feel that that idea really comes in many ways from that kind of whole Enlightenment science period of, the ideas of Descartes, which is very much about the purpose of science is to render humans as masters and possessors of nature. I think that's kind of one of the things in there. It's really to render, us as masters and possessors of nature. And that's real, to me, that's a really hubristic project, right? Because it really questions uh, it questions our place in the world. Are we here as masters and possessors of nature, or are we here, as the Native Americans saw it, as stewards? Or as we would say, as the Khalifa. And I mean, one very stark example when I was there, I came into account of was really how the buffalo was, which was always an integral part of the life of the Native Americans, how that was really destroyed because the European powers that went there, they'd realized that this was the buffalo had a sacred and had a spiritual connection to the Native American people, and just as you know, uh, when a Christian sees a church and they see a cross, it means something, right? So in the same way, for the Native American, when they saw the buffalo, it meant something. There was a spiritual connection. So what they did, they actually went about, in a very mechanistic, instrumental way of slaughtering the buffalo population of North America, so that historians estimate there was something like 30 million buffalo in North America, and that went down to a few hundred,
Yeah.
right? I think
Mhm.
if you look at
Mhm.
Yellowstone Valley, there was 23 buffalo left, right?
Yeah. Yes.
23. And the US government had been trying to do this, fix this problem for a long time. And eventually, some years ago now, they handed over the husbandry of the buffalo in Yellowstone back to the Native Americans. And suddenly, within a few years, the population goes up to about 4,000 buffalo, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Because the Native Americans still, despite all the genocide that happened to them, despite all that, they still possessed that sacred knowledge of how to look after the land, how to look after the buffalo. So I think, for people around the world in different communities who feel the weight, impinging weight of modernism, mechanization, technology, almost like throttling their way of life, there is hope. There's always hope because, as you said, things are cyclical, right? So there's always hope, but you need to be able to connect back to that tradition, just as those Native Americans did, to make that connection back. Because unfortunately, the other side of looking at sacred knowledge is that the other people don't believe in sacred knowledge. They believe that the knowledge they've created now is the best knowledge. Whereas perhaps other people in the world, such as us, would say, well, not necessarily, not necessarily. Um, yeah, so I don't know if you want to, if you've got sort of, since you are
Yeah.
from the US, and your American history knowledge is far better than mine, so maybe you
Not
want to
so
add
much.
something there.
Yeah, I think the story with the buffalo or the bison, and you find that repeated in many places. But at the same time, I have a feeling or the hope that you can destroy certain aspects of a culture or certain symbols of it, but I think that culture will always, be there and live on within that population. It never goes away, and that's actually my hope also for the Muslim people and their religious tradition, though it might be in a kind of a receded a little bit from people's consciousness for the most part, but it's never too far from the surface. Um, and I think even you saw that with going back to the Meccans, and many of them were polytheists, but they were 600 years separated from the last prophet that may have visited them, or more. Let's say Jesus didn't go to the Arabian Peninsula, maybe from Ibrahim, which is more than 1,000 years perhaps. But they still had those qualities of honesty and chivalry and trustworthiness were upheld, or at least respected. And, there is an inherent, I think, power in humanity to really, the ability to bounce back from these sorts of things. And it could happen within a generation or two. And if we think, how long was the prophetic mission? It was 23 years. And within 23 years, centuries before that were changed, and there was a completely different course that was happening. And we say, there's nothing impossible for God, right? Uh, but I think for us as human beings, what we're trying to do is just kind of be a part of that. I don't want to say part of the solution. That's kind of a modernism, but part of what's moving forward, and we'll bring about a better situation, better circumstance for us and for others. And you mentioned Native Americans and the bison. I think it's very important, just as a side note, that it's easy to be bitter about these things and carry a lot of that as a weight. But I don't think that actually will prove to be positive in the long run, right? It's not going to help you fix things or change things. It's just going to be a weight upon you. And so part of that is not to be so bitter and to move, in the best manner that you can. And you need a community to do that. You need cooperation. You need collaboration. You need people helping one another, helping one another up. So, like what you mentioned earlier about what do we do now, I think any small sustained effort, will go a long way. And if you think, the number of companions who lived in Mecca who made the hijrah was less than 100 out of 5,000 people who lived in Mecca, and that was 13 years into the mission. So within less than 10 years, basically, the whole Arabian Peninsula changed, and also beyond the Arabian Peninsula within a quarter century. Uh, so I think people are good at heart, and people have the ability to see what's good, but you have to tap into their better selves, is the idea, right? And every human being on the face of the planet has that potential, and I think we have to always remember that, and not kind of dismiss and marginalize, and that's because that's what's done to other peoples. But for us, I think we have to look at the best of it. Inshallah, that's what our teachers taught us, and we're trying to do that to the best of our ability.
Yeah, yeah, no, no, for sure. And I think what this also reminds me of is the fact that we almost need to deliberately kind of wake ourselves up to the sensory environment around us, because to some extent it can happen to all of us. You kind of go around in a kind of a sleepwalking, somnambulant kind of situation. One study comes to mind, which was it was a German study done by the German Psychological Association over 20 years, and what they found was that the sensory acuity of German students was declining by 1% a year. Now, when we say sensory acuity, that would be like, for example, I go out, you go to the park and then you come back and someone asks you a question and says, hey, what did you see? What did you smell? What did you hear? How many flowers can you recall? What kind of shades were the leaves on the
Mm,
trees? That's your sensory acuity, right? So it's your
okay.
So what they were finding was that every year for these German undergraduates, and they did the study for 20 years, every
Mm,
year sensory acuity dropped by 1%, like every
mm,
year. So the undergraduates who came 20 years later were 20% less
mm,
attuned to their sensory environment than the graduates 20 years before. Now, they looked at this and they concluded from this study that the result was screens.
Hmm.
Okay, that was now the interesting thing is this study concluded in 1989. So they were looking at television screens, right? They were looking at the impact of television screens, right? So not like, computers, not smartphones. This is a study that finished in the 80s, and they were looking at the impact of sensory acuity or the loss of it. So we know that this is happening around us. So the question then really becomes, and certainly as an artist and someone who is of that world, but even if you're not an artist, I think we have to almost like take the reverse of that and say, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, to look at the signs on the horizon, right? So it's almost like look up, right? Look
Hmm.
up, right? Rather than
Yeah.
looking down at our screens and narrowing our
Yes.
vision. If we look up, I remember a few years ago, I was having breakfast in my downstairs in the breakfast area, and it just suddenly occurred to me that there were so many birds in my garden, and I didn't know the names of them. And I thought,
Mm.
this is appalling. There are so many birds. So I then spent the next few weeks counting all the birds and the bird types and identified every single bird. And then I realized that I actually had 10 species of birds
Hmm.
coming into our garden. And I learned the names of every single bird. And now I know, oh, this is a manna. This is a white-cheeked bulbul. Okay, or this is a hoopy bird, and so on and so on.
Mm.
And that to me was just my a laziness on my part that I wasn't following the instructions of God to look up at the signs on the horizon, the beauty around us, And I think in many ways that to me is one way we can connect with with the sacred because it's around us, right? But we just need to look at it. We need to connect with it rather than looking down at these kind of screens and spending our life there as well. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's an amazing observation. I think it's amazing how if you just take the time to get away from it and just get up and literally walk outside and how your perspective changes and you things see things quite differently. And I used to remember a time when children, most of their day would be spent outside, and that my childhood was for the most part, and probably yours as well, was like that. And nowadays, no. Everything again, we have this over mediation of your experience, and everything is via a prism of someone constructed in an office boardroom somewhere or a lab or something like that. Even our food is like that. That's a whole nother topic, but it's obvious that I think we have the ability to kind of see where the issues and the problems are, but the challenges will be how to address them and come over them. And that's why we say the sacred knowledge and the knowledge of those who came before us, though most of the world may have dismissed what they were doing, they actually seem to have gotten it right in many things. And it would behoove us to kind of take a second look at that. And I remember I read a book a long time ago, maybe over 2 decades, I think. I can't remember quite the title, but the author was saying what we can learn from the 18th century. And he kind of pointed out, and this was a European, I think, not a Muslim, and he was pointing out how certain things were done in the 18th century and how modern society has a lot that they can implement from that and take into account. So I think there's a lot of people thinking along these lines, and I think people who are working in sustainability, for example, and I'm aware that they're looking at older models of like of housing and keeping places cool with global warming. They're looking at more traditional models of how houses used to be built, because they were built in a way to actually keep the house cool in the summer and warm in the winter, rather than the concrete blocks that we become accustomed to. So there's a wealth of knowledge there. I'm not going to say information, but a wealth of knowledge. It's not just what's in the books, but you have to actually find the people who possess that knowledge and know how to implement it and are skillful in it. So that's definitely a project that that's important.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah, no, great, great. Well, look, as we kind of wrap up, I think every episode we want to kind of maybe give the listeners a sense of also some of the things that we've been reading, maybe, or some of the things maybe we've been watching, or some of the things that we've been listening. And I've certainly got a couple of things I can put into onto the table. But maybe Dr. Waleed, maybe you could just maybe share with the listeners some of the things that have been occupying your mind recently when it comes to reading or watching or listening?
Sure. I mean, a lot of my time is spent just kind of keeping myself fresh and reviewing things that I should have still committed better to memory, but still have to spend some time. And obviously, that includes the Quran and some of the Hadith and other books. But yani, when I have a chance, I do like to read in other things. Um, One of the books I've been reading over the summer, it's written in Arabic. It's called The Psychology of Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani, and which is probably a bit of a misnomer. It's more about his life and his legacy and his approach to teaching and spreading. And he also lived in a very tumultuous time, and with maybe also this foreboding sense that we have today, also like what's going on and where's it going. And that was someone that amazes me. Just basically rolls up his sleeves and gets to work, and he becomes a fixture in Baghdad. And he really his career, so to speak, didn't really kind of take off and take hold until he was nearly 60. Uh, when he was 58 is when he kind of had his madrasa and ribat and let's say training tarbiyah center in place, and then he lives the next 30 years of his life, and that's till he passes away. That's what he's doing, 30 plus years of his life. So that's more of along the cyclical thing. I like to read and see what did people do in the past and how they faced the challenges that they were facing. Uh, and on another note, I'm kind of into horsemanship lately, so I've been reading a lot about that. And there's a particular author named Mark Rashid. I don't know what his origin, if it's Arab or not, but he has a series of books. One of them is called Whole Heart, Whole Horse. And to me, the way he talks about it, there is a sanctity to it. And the horse is, I don't want to say it's a sacred animal, like in the religious sense, but it is a majestic animal and often mentioned in the Sunnah and often mentioned by the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And he said that the good will be in the in the forelock of the horse till Yom al Qiyamah, till the last day. So to me, it's not just a vehicle for conducting wars, as was in the ancient past, but something more than that. And there is something majestic and beautiful, and to have that sort of animal cooperating with you as your partner under saddle, it's kind of amazing training for the nafs, actually, for your own soul, because you're dealing with another nafs, another ego, and then you have your own ego, and then how to manage those two together. So those things have been lately of interest to me, and you know, I try to keep active and busy and physically active also. So that's important.
Good. Yeah. So I think a couple of things then from my side. I suppose a few things I've been reading. I think I'll probably more attuned to giving book recommendations. So I normally read three or four books at the same time, depending on the genre. So I've been reading on terms of fiction, The Count of Monte Cristo by
Mm,
Alexander Dumas, and a couple of people actually recommended the book to me recently, and I hadn't read it, I must confess. And it's just a phenomenal story, and it's very much positioned as a story of revenge about a young man, Edmond Dante, who gets put into jail for really something that he didn't do. And how he becomes the Count of Monte Cristo, and then how he seeks his revenge and vengeance. But I'm not entirely sure that's the story, because really, to me, when I read it, the line that resonated the most to me was that when one of the people who he's responsible for, putting him in a dungeon for 20 years, when he eventually gets his own back at him, then he
mm,
says to him, "I forgive you because I too wish to be forgiven.
mm,
He wishes to be forgiven by God. So he's forgiving someone else." So to me, that was really one of the most powerful lines in the novel. So when he has a
mm,
chance to really punish one of the men who destroyed his life, he says, "I forgive you because I also wish to be forgiven."
mm.
So that was just a great adventure story. The quality of the writing, it's like having honey in your mouth. It's just so sweet, and the prose. Oh, it was just I almost like
Mashallah.
I wanted to go back to the start of the book and start reading it again, but I had some other books to read, so I couldn't. I definitely plan to have a second read of it. It's one of those books that you just want to put into a book club, but the
Mm.
problem is it's 1,200 pages. And I think if you put
Wow.
that into a book club, most of the people aren't going to turn up for the next session. So I'm kind of a little bit reluctant to do that.
Mhm.
The second book that I read recently was The Road to Makkah by Muhammad Asad. And it's a
Mm.
book that I know we've both read, and I certainly read it first time. I think it was 1992, 93. And then I reread it 20 plus years, well, 30 years later, really.
Mm.
And I think that the book, there's definitely, when you look at what Muhammad Asad was talking about, the impact of the West culturally on the Arab world, he was spot on, completely spot on. And the
Mm.
loss of what life was like here in the region before, I think that
Mm.
has definitely stood the test of time. Maybe some of the other things in the book are a little bit, not quite, but that impact on culture is very fresh. So it's a great, travel book about how a an Austrian Jewish journalist called Leopold Weiss embraces Islam in the 1920s, and
Mm.
then his journey into Arabia, his friendship with Ibn Saud, then his leaving Arabia, going to Pakistan, becoming Pakistan's kind of ambassador to the United Nations, and then onwards after that, he did many things and wrote many books as well. So it's a really fascinating story of a great individual. And interestingly, no one's actually done a deep biography of Muhammad Asad, but when I was in London recently, a friend of mine was mentioning that there's a particular scholar who is doing a biography on Muhammad Asad as well, which I think will be very, very interesting to read.
Mm.
And then the last book I would recommend, and this one maybe for the parents who are listening, maybe they want to read it. It's a couple of years old, but it's very relevant. It's a book called Glow Kids. So Glow,
Mm.
as in Glow, Glow Kids, by Nicholas Cardaras. And Nicholas Cardaras is one of the world's leading experts on addiction and how people
Mm.
get addicted. And why he calls it Glow Kids is because he said that one day he was on holiday in a very beautiful part of the world, and he went down to the basement to this kind of building he was in to a toilet, and he saw some American kids who, rather than being outside in the incredible scenery outside, were just sitting in a corridor with their phones in a dark corridor with their phones, and the
Mm.
phones were like glowing onto their faces, right?
Mm. Mhm.
So the book is called Glow Kids. The kids are in the glow of the smartphone.
Right.
And he just thought it was just so like, bizarre that you have this incredible landscape just outside and these kids were sitting there. So it's really a book about how the attention economy and how the addiction technologies work. So I think that's important for parents to understand. And more importantly, what can you do about it as well? Because you can do something about it. And I think that's something that we probably will cover in maybe a different program. So I think, Dr. Libolid, I think our time is up, unless you have some last kind of words of wisdom and comments before we close down.
No, it's been a pleasure, and I hope that what we discussed prove interesting, and hopefully we can further collaborate and address the challenges that we have and these phenomena that we're facing, and with encroaching technology and modernity and the outputs of that. But I think there's a lot of reason to be hopeful, and I hope people were able to hear that from us, and look forward to doing that together, inshallah.
Yeah, no, inshallah. No, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Waleed. And really, as I say, just thank you to all listeners. And I hope that we achieved what we were planning to achieve, which was to really explore the ideas and some of the themes that are shaping human thought and practice. And we'll be, covering a topic every week. So thank you to all the listeners, and may the peace and blessings of God be upon you.